Good afternoon. Are you guys ready? I think you are. All right. I know many of you know me. I'm Babu Krishnamurthy. It's my pleasure to be the Director of the Human Subjects Protection Office and to welcome you to today's very unique, very exciting clinical research team rounds. I want to begin by giving Nancy Brown the floor for just a minute to explain to you guys how to get CME and nursing contact hours for this presentation.
This program has been approved for nursing contact hours and physician CME credits. If you would like these, just please see me after the program. There's certain requirements. There is one evaluation for everyone for this program, whether you're getting the credits or not. We'd like you to all complete them. At the end, if you want the credits, you can see me and give me your evaluation because you're required to stay for the whole program and complete the evaluation, and I'll give you the certificate. And I also want to announce that the speaker has declared no conflict of interest with the content of this program, and also that there is real commercial support for this program. And those two questions are in the evaluation, so this is your being informed of those two questions.
Thank you, Nancy. I want to also let you all know that we are videotaping and audio taping this program. So please, when you ask your questions, please ask them as loudly as you can. Our speaker has graciously agreed that she will repeat the question if any of you couldn't hear it for the purposes of this recording. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome Dr. Tamara Norton-Smith, who is the founder and president and chief compliance officer of Norton Audits. To give you a little bit of background, which I just find fascinating, not only does Dr. Smith have a BA in psychology and chemistry from Columbia College, but she has a PhD in criminology from Stratford University. I want to tell you a little bit more, I guess, more personally about Dr. Smith, which is that not only has she been an FDA auditor, but she actually, as recently as the last couple of months, was called upon by someone in the FDA to serve as a speaker, as a keynote speaker. Now, I think it's pretty impressive that the FDA calls for help, and when they do, they're calling for someone who is now here to tell you all about sort of living your life in compliance with the FDA. And Dr. Smith and I were chatting for a few minutes before the presentation, and I think we both agree that when the FDA calls, it's one of the most stressful things I think any of us in clinical research can encounter. It really does nothing more than just send a wave of panic through your body, and at that moment you start to reflect on your entire life and whether or not you want to continue your research career for even one more day. As someone who's gone through an FDA audit and happily went through with flying colors, I will tell you that the one thing that makes it tolerable is knowing, going into it, that you have developed standard operating procedures and that you have adhered to them. And so it really is such a overwhelming pleasure for me to have Dr. Smith here. I've heard her speak before, and I think that one of her strengths is not only is she going to give you a tremendous amount of information, but she's going to make it very palatable for you and very manageable, I must say, as something that all of us could very readily incorporate into our daily lives. And I would beg of you not only to reflect on what she's saying as she says it, but you'll have the opportunity to review this videotape later. Please do take it back to your friends and family, to the people that you work with, to encourage them to do the right thing so that when the FDA calls, they don't need to panic. So, Dr. Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? For the back up there? Okay. This is one of my favorite topics. It's something that I live every day. It's really the FDA inspection process. As a teacher, I think sometimes it's more important for us to stand the why. So I've divided this program up into two parts. The first part is I'm going to explain to you why there is this regulatory process. Then I'm going to walk you through how you handle the regulatory process as we go through it. So in these two parts, I want you to understand if you're doing clinical research, and I'll talk much more about this as we get into the legalistic parts of this, but there's a relationship now, if you're participating in research trials, between you and the U.S. government. And that's going to be part one of how I explain that. And then part two is really the regulatory application process. Like, what does the FDA do once an application goes in for a product to come onto the marketplace that you have tested? And so I'll take you through that process and then how you would actually host the FDA actually being here. You're also going to find in the second part of the program, as we get towards the end of the slides, because I know I have quite a few slides to get through, you're going to see that there's more procedural steps for you to go back to and reflect on that you can read a little bit later, but I'll hit the highlights of those with you. So as we go through the program, I'm going to really show you the FDA inspectional process, why it happens this way in the United States of America, and then also talk to you about how to interact between the auditor, investigator process, and several other parts that we'll look at is really try to increasing your good clinical practice skills overall for the inspection process and really try to increase your opportunity to have successful outcomes in the audit and investigative process done by the FDA. And these are just some of the things that we're going to look for to help you meet the criteria of the good clinical practices, really trying to show how we host the FDA inspection process, and most importantly, why that we should be respectful of the FDA process overall when they do come to call on us for external audits. So there's this relationship between you and the U.S. government now. And when you participate in a trial, you inherit certain responsibilities. Now, what's interesting about this particular law, and there's not much like it, but when we look at Title 21 that kind of governs research, it's aimed at particular individuals of responsibility. So you're familiar with sponsors of trials that might be on the industry side. You think of sponsors such as Merck, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, et cetera. Those are what we call big sponsors who have a vested financial interest in research. Then you have the individuals that they hire to actually independently conduct the research, which is the investigator. Now, what I mean about this law being very personal is that it's aimed at a particular sponsor. If you're a particular sponsor of a trial under 21 CFR 312, you have certain drug responsibilities that you must do for the federal government. If you are a clinical investigator under the law in 312.60, you have specific responsibilities. And then if you do drugs or you do devices, there are certain regulations for those. But the law is very personal because it calls out particular individuals. And so I'll ask you guys a question, just going to test good clinical practice knowledge. There's a couple other titles used in the regulations. If you are not a sponsor or a contract research organization used by a sponsor that they sometimes contract to, and if you're not an IRB member, who are you guys in the regulations if you're not a clinical investigator? What's your title called? Sub-investigator. That's exactly right. So sometimes when you're called a research coordinator or a study nurse, you might be kind of confused about, well, where do I fit into the regulations? Because those are industry terms. The terms that you are a sub-investigator. If we look at 21 CFR 312, which is really the new drug regulations and where those are found, a sub-investigator is any other member of that clinical research team. That is how a sub-investigator is defined. Now, I know that when we look at certain procedures and policies that are written here, we've got many different titles floating around. And that is actually being worked on to be streamlined of what positions everybody will hold to the form FDA 1572. And I'll talk a little bit more to you about that. So you actually are a sub-investigator. And I wanted to make that clear, that clinical research nurse, clinical research coordinator, study nurse, et cetera, those terms are actually industry or academic terms. They're not regulation terms, just to be clear on that. Now, on an everyday FDA inspection process, they're going to come in once an application is filed. This has been their model in the past. So what happens is a sponsor organization is ready to file their investigational test article for an application to be approved to be a drug marketed in the United States of America. You cannot market a drug in the U.S. without it having FDA approval. The process that you guys are participating on, particularly when you do industry-sponsored trials, is the process of trying to get that drug to market so we can then market it in the U.S. It's illegal to call something a drug until it has been approved and been proven to be safe and effective in the United States. Now, when the FDA comes in, they're primarily coming in under what we call administrative law. A very powerful law here at the bottom. Administrative law is basically what we call Title 21. Now, you may say, well, administrative doesn't sound too bad, but administrative is we send you a nasty letter called a warning letter, and we put certain conditions on you that you need to meet. Or we say your performance is so egregious we can debar you from research, which means you cannot handle or have any more investigational products. The FDA has actually started new regulations also if you are debarred from research that you will literally also not be able to participate in the trial process. So not only not receive investigational products, but you couldn't be a sub-investigator on someone else's trial. So that's currently being worked on now. But there's these other federal laws that you should be aware of. And this is not to make you nervous or make you sensitive, but I think as an institution, particularly if you're an investigator or you're helping a sub-investigator on a study, you should be aware there are other federal laws that are also in play. Anytime that a federal investigator comes into this facility, there is also civil laws that you can look at, as well as criminal violations. There's a criminal act, for example, to falsify study records. That can be handled under different laws that have different penalties if you look actually in the capital punishment and fines. So the majority of time, the FDA can do their business based on administrative law, which is a preponderance of evidence. And so let me give you a little bit of example. If I want to take you to a criminal prosecution, my level of what I've got to prove is higher. In administrative law, we have to prove a preponderance of an evidence. All the blood pressures look like they're the same. And a copy of that record pretty much meets administrative law. If I want to take you into a court case, then I might have to prove something to a higher standard. And I just want you to know from this, these are all the laws that we're actually looking at and that the FDA investigator can go into if certain conditions are met. Now, the majority of the time, you're going to deal with administrative law and things are going to stop there, hopefully. And that might be the issuance of the form FDA 483, which will tell you the findings that they have to federal violations, or it may be a warning letter, for example. And I'll tell you a few other things, tools that they actually have. These are the regulations that you follow. This course is not designed to take you through each and every one of those. It's just to help you understand the inspection readiness process. But you're familiar with these, Part 50 for human protections, 56, 54, which is financial disclosure, 312, and 812. Some of you also probably participate sometimes on combination products between drugs and devices as well. Now, how the FDA administers, and this is where regulations become tricky. You have regulations that are printed out in 50, 54, 56, 312, and 812. But then the FDA, as a government agency, actually has to apply and use the regulations. So they developed a program that we call BIMO. That is short for Bioresearch Monitoring Program, and it's called BIMO within the agency. This is their SOP, Standard Operating Procedure, for how they do your inspection, right? And I'll explain that a little bit further in actually how they do these things. But this program has two major objectives. It's to make sure that human subjects are safe as they participate in research trials, and then also looking at the integrity of the data that is provided. That's what this program does. The data collected and performed by you supports the outcome that we say for new drugs. Now, I want to make a point that as an institution, I've communicated that I thought there was some blurriness on. And some of that blurriness is this. Some of the trials that you participate on for industry are not medical treatment. They're the last thing but medical treatment. And you're going to see on some of the slides here that it's actually illegal to say that they are medical treatment before they've been proven to be safe or effective. When you're participating on an industry trial, whether it's phase 1, 2, or 3, they're looking to see, is the drug potentially new and safe and effective? Does that new drug actually work to be safe and effective? So there's a prohibition actually in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that you would say to someone, an auditor like myself, or to a human subject, that that product has already been proven to be safe. That's why you're doing the research, and that's why it's called research. If you are looking at new labeling or a change in the labeling that goes with that product, it is investigational, and it is illegal and a prohibition to say that it is there for medical treatment. You're trying to determine if it's good enough to be medical treatment. That's on your shoulders and your investigator's shoulders. Okay. A little bit more on that in a second. The other part that I want to make sure is clear, because if you're not in the audit process, you may not really understand what is the difference between the monitors that come to our facilities, the auditors that come, and the FDA that comes. And I know if you don't work in the regulated industry, that can be confusing, and I find some confusing sometimes whenever I'm working with different organizations. When a quality assurance auditor comes, such as from Dana-Farber, QACT, those individuals should be measuring the standards set by the organization, which is their executive leadership. They have policies and procedures. Their auditors go out and they give feedback to executive management. Are we following the standards that you guys set? So for example, if I do an audit of you, I'm going to say, did you actually meet the criteria of 21 CFR 312.60, which is clinical investigator general responsibilities? And then I'm going to say, did you meet it or did you not? This is how you didn't meet it. All right? A monitor is a little bit different. You hear the term monitoring. Those individuals are what we call quality control. They're coming out after the standards have actually been set, and they're looking more at it on a daily basis to see, and a more frequent basis to see, are you actually following that standard that is met too, but they're bringing out samples of it. A little bit different. So it's really the role of QA to say, are we meeting the standards we said that we were going to follow? Monitoring goes out and samples and says, did we actually meet it? And that criteria comes back to the audit process. We then may order audits and so forth. Now, the FDA inspection process is a little bit different. For example, in the industry, I audit. I have auditors, they audit. You have monitors that come and they do a term that we call monitoring. But then you have the FDA, and they come in and they do a term we call investigating or inspecting. And that's different than just audits. Investigating or inspection kind of goes back to those 3 tiers of the law. If they have certain reasons that they need to rack it up and do a formal investigation, they can. FDA investigators, sometimes I hear them called FDA inspectors. The real term and the real job description that they have is called a consumer safety officer, or they're called, for slang, FDA investigator. There are inspectors in the FDA, and there are investigators in the FDA. The ones that will audit you are actually called FDA investigators. And it's actually somewhat of an insult to call someone an inspector when they're actually not, because that's a different grade scale. So sometimes when I see someone called an FDA inspector, I'm like, well, that's kind of sensitive because it's really not what they are. So it's a little bit more correct to call them an FDA investigator or a consumer safety officer, a CSO. So that's the difference between quality control and QC. And as we get into this topic a little bit more, I just want you to understand the distinction between those. So one way to have it clear in your mind, QA, when they come out, they're looking at the input. What do we input into the system and say, this is how we're going to do research? And then QC comes out and looks at, well, once we follow these standards, did we actually have the right standards in place and did we actually measure it properly, looking at the sampling? Now, the FDA process, you might be interested to know, well, how is the FDA going to select me? Well, the FDA has a new algorithm that they actually follow, and this is pretty much a risk-based system. In the past, they've been wanting to inspect the highest enroller, for example. Now, if you'll see here, they have different risk criteria. And to let you know, for full disclosure, this is not the exact calculation because they won't release that to the industry, nor should they, because then we could project who they're going to actually go and actually inspect. So when we look at, they're now looking at enrollment as a key, any prior complaints, any history with the FDA, how many protocol deviations did you have compared to other investigators? So it's a little smarter system. They put a calculation based on, well, how much of the efficacy data are you providing and how much of the safety data are you providing? And it goes into a calculation to say, which investigator do we actually want to go back and inspect or start inspecting for the first time? And it's interesting, I have some investigators in history that have been inspected by the FDA for 10 times in their career, and I have some that have yet to have their first inspection in 20 years. So I'm not quite sure how that happens, but the system is being tighter now that they're using this algorithm, and certain physicians come out of that. To talk about the bioresearch monitoring program, as we've been working here at BIDMC, we actually handed out copies of this document that the FDA conducts their audits to, their standard operating procedure, or what we call the compliance policy manual for the FDA investigator. And as you'll see, this program, which is bioresearch monitoring, they have these particular guidances that they follow. The one that would help you the most to know as a clinical investigator or study team member is going to be 7348.811. If you look at this document, it's written to the FDA investigator how to inspect a clinical investigator and their research team. So if you were to use this document, you would see exactly the documents they're going to ask you for, exactly where they're going to go. And another reason this is important for you to be familiar with this document is to know whenever they go off their procedure. Because a consultant like myself, I like to know if the FDA is doing something different than their normal procedure, immediately what goes into my brain is, well, they might be working on a different law here, or something else might be wrong, and I need to know that so I can do some preventative and questions of the FDA. So for example, we have several inspections that are happening at Mass General at this moment. We have 2 FDA separate inspections that started back to back, week to week, for 2 different physicians with an overall PI located elsewhere. So that inspection has really started to spread out. First of all, they came in looking at 1 physician at MGH, and now they've asked for records from 2 other facilities. And the FDA can do that depending on where the research actually occurred. That's important for a consultant to know. Did they go off the scope that they're starting to? So you being familiar with this document is keenly important, because once you go through an FDA inspection, if it starts to change, there might be certain conditions that we would want you to communicate, and I'll share those with you as we go through. So another question might be, well, what is it that these crazy auditors and FDA investigators are looking for anyway? So if the BIMO program, Bioresearch Monitoring Program, is really looking to measure safety of human subjects while they're participating, and if it's looking to look at data integrity as it's going through and quality, how do we measure that? Well, the first thing is we look for what we call negligence. Sometimes when you do research, you might have minor negligence, which is basic sloppiness that can be corrected to a certain level. Now, you're going to find as you go through the audit process or inspection process, when you make a mistake, sometimes it can't be corrected. It's done and it's a part of history. That's a misnomer that happens in research. Sometimes we think we can turn the clock and go back and correct things. No, that's why when I was being introduced, it's so important for you to have processes and systems that really work for you. And I'll talk more about that also. So negligence is really defined as when you do your research, is there some data that might be compromised that doesn't have enough integrity or quality, and the sponsor of the trial has to throw some of that data out and finds it unusable. So for example of that would be a subject that not properly informed consented. That could and should result in not using that subject's data until you go back and get permission from that subject to use their data because they weren't properly informed consented. So a regulatory safety issue can also impact data quality. And then there should also be consideration when we're looking at data as we go out in the audit process, is there scientific misconduct? And this is not a scientific misconduct class, but to touch a little bit on scientific misconduct, it really is the reckless failure to follow the protocol or regulations or to manipulate the data in some way in which we would throw all of that data out. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be false information. It could just be the information is so poor because we didn't follow the protocol, and that's what we call non-compliance. It can be so severe that we can actually consider that scientific misconduct. So these are the levels that we're actually looking for in the audit process. Fortunately, here at BIDMC, we haven't met any criteria of scientific misconduct, which is great. We're much in those areas of some sloppiness that might go on, or because of missing processes, we're not actually following the protocol, some of the negligence there. We haven't been in a case, I don't think so far, that we've actually said we really feel like you shouldn't submit this data in a U.S. application. The FDA has recently put out some information on data quality. See, folks like myself, when we're in the regulatory environment, we throw these words around like risk management, data quality, data integrity, but sometimes we don't put definitions with those. And so the FDA came out and said, this is how we define data quality. Data quality is this information is attributable. Is that information attributable? Is it legible, contemporaneously, done at the time and recorded at the time it was actually occurred? Original and accurate. These are the attributes that they're actually measuring when they're out. Now, a really good way to look at a research study, particularly involving human research subjects, all of you, many of you, I'll say all of you, have been in a scientific class of some type. And if you've been in chemistry, you've done some bench chemistry that might have involved a beaker, and maybe you've got a Bunsen burner and it's heating up and there's a few chemicals that you put in and there's a chemical reaction that occurs, and you're writing in your chemistry notebook all these things that are actually happening so that you can get the A on the paper, right? That's the same thing that's happening in a research subject. That experiment is actually happening inside of the human subject based on their physiology and how they're actually detailing that drug through their body. So the key there is those same observations when a patient comes in for a visit and you're writing things down, you're doing this same thing that you're doing in a chemistry lab. You just can't see what's happening inside the human subject. And that's why you measure urines, that's why you measure protein, that's why you're measuring all the different things in the chemistry panels and so forth that we actually measure. That's why you're doing ECGs at certain time points to make sure that experiment that's happening with this new drug, new test article, is actually not hurting the subject so that you can end up getting an application through the FDA to have a new product. So let me take that one step further to say these particular regulations, particularly something that would fall under 21 CFR 312, because most of you participate on drug trials, or 812 for medical devices, it is a misnomer in the regulations to call these things drugs, because it's not a drug. In the United States of America, if you have an investigational product, it's not a drug. Now, when you receive it, it's going to look like a drug, smell like a drug, be packaged like a drug. But it's really funny, it's labeled investigational, right? So it's not a drug yet because it can't be marketed in the United States as a drug. So it's not a drug. It's an investigational test article. It's an investigational product. Now, it acts like a drug. That sponsor hopes that it's safe and effective, and they actually are hoping that it will do what it's saying it's going to do on their future labeling. But you're the ones telling them that it's safe or effective. So your documentation has to meet also that criteria to prove it's safe or effective. And that's why you have to hit the protocol when you hit it, because it's not medical treatment, it's an investigational product. Any questions on that before we go any further, or any on those slides?
So I have a question about a couple slides back about protocol deviations.
Yes.
That the FDA may find a little abnormal and maybe like a cue to kind of go into a facility and try out what's going on. How exactly do they find out about those deviations? Because we report it to our local IRB. Does the local IRB have to report that to them?
That's a really good question. So the question is, you have various protocol deviations. The FDA doesn't know about those. They go to our local IRB. How does the FDA know? How does that process work? And that's a great question. How that works is each sponsor has different annual requirements to send in reports to the FDA. Safety reports, data reports, depending on their approval to start the trial. So at the end of the study, they actually complete what we call a clinical study report. And literally, it will have all the deviations listed per site, per investigator, of all the deviations that have occurred, or they'll have to submit them annually. Also, the monitors that write up different reports about the investigator that covers generally all the deviations that have occurred, and the FDA has the right to see those monitoring reports throughout this process anytime. So they can actually request those prior to your audit and get copies of monitoring reports from the sponsor. There have been cases, and the FDA tries not to look at quality assurance reports so that we can honestly look at ourselves, but they can actually get any audit report also that I would write. Many times they haven't asked for those to try to respect the process of the privacy of the audit process, but the monitoring process is open because it's quality control, so they can get those. But how that works is the sponsor, let's say you're doing a trial that involves 100 investigators. They put all that into a tabulation with the investigator's number and their name, and that appears in that clinical study report. So, for example, the current FDA investigators that are on site this week and last week, they actually have copies of all those deviations in that whole entire clinical study report, or if it's like phase 1, for example, anything that's been submitted by the sponsor that's data, they bring that with them, and they'll open it up and see, did Pfizer leave something out in the data or the data analysis? They're trying to check on the sponsor while they're here also, but they actually have those tabulations with them when they come out for the inspections. Pretty fascinating. Okay? Thank you. That was really good. So after this process works out, at the end of the inspection process, the FDA investigator is going to leave the clinical investigator and their study teams, and they're going to come back and they're going to do an initial classification on the inspection. And I want you to be familiar with no action indicated, which means no form FDA 483 was issued, which is a great thing. There were no observations that they felt like violations were there. Or voluntary action indicated means you did receive a 483 that had some deviations and warnings on there, and then that might result in what we call an untitled letter, or they'll let the 483 speak for itself, but that is an official warning from the FDA when you receive a 483, and that's why no one wants to receive it. And any time in the industry that you receive a 483 as a clinical investigator, every single study thereafter, you're going to be providing that 483 to every sponsor that selects you for a trial, because they're going to see that you've addressed that problem, and you'll go through that. If your official action indicated is where you don't want to be, this means that you did receive a 483. The FDA has to issue a 483, generally before they issue a warning letter. This is where they have very significant findings, and they're going to issue a warning letter or worse. A warning letter could result in further actions, which could be debarment if you do not come back and actually show that you took the matter seriously, and I'll demonstrate one of those to you. So those are the end of the process. Now, you might have noticed our company name is Norton Audits Incorporated, NAI. Back in the day when I first started this organization, I had hopes of people that used our services would be NAI. So I thought that was pretty smart. It doesn't work out that way. You need to come to us early, and then we can help you be NAI. But what I found is a lot of times you're not in that condition. But that's NAI, OAI, and VAI, and those are very important because if you look on the FDA's website, It's going to list all inspections that have happened for anyone that has filed the form FDA 1572. It's going to have any observations that were found, and it's out there for public dissemination. How the FDA punishes the industry, how they punish the industry is by publicizing this information. And so you'll see OAI, VAI, and NAI out listed on the website. They'll also publish the warning letters, and that's how they kind of police the industry. Okay. So there are other inspections that the FDA does under this program. I don't want to spend a long time on this, but just to show you that they have inspections that are study-oriented, meaning that they're looking at the sponsor's data, looking at the application, or maybe there's been a complaint against the individual investigator and it's investigator-oriented, because a sponsor or an IRB can file a complaint against an investigator as well as a human subject or a monitor or someone in the industry. And they also do bioequivalence studies. So just to let you know, sometimes when the FDA comes out, they're doing study-oriented inspections, and it's pretty routine. But they may be doing other inspections also if it's an investigator complaint, depending on that risk and if the FDA has prior information about that investigator. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on law, the regulations are very purposely designed the way that they are. There's this purposeful design for an umbrella of protection before these products get to the marketplace and can be used to treat cancer. So there are regulations for the sponsor, for the IRB, as well as the clinical investigator. So for example, let's say the sponsor provides a monitor, and many of you have different monitors that are a weaker monitor. Let's just say they come, they get paid, they don't really do their job. But let's say you've got a fantastic PI, a principal investigator or a clinical investigator that does their job well. Well, human subject safety is still maintained, even if you had a weak sponsor. Let's say you have a sponsor that's a virtual sponsor. And there are virtual sponsors out there that really don't do manufacturing. Someone else does that for them, and they're a virtual company. And they don't know good clinical practice as well, but they get through and they get a good investigator. Well, safety is maintained. Where noncompliance occurs is when you've got a weak IRB system, a weaker investigator that don't know these regulations very well, and then you have a sponsor that's not as engaged as they should be. That sets up an imbalance in the check and balances in the regulations, and that's how noncompliance generally occurs. To help you understand the FDA inspectional process, what is going to happen is the FDA receives an assignment out to the district offices from headquarters. Headquarters comes out with an assignment to look at a specific protocol under the FDA's inspection practices. They will then come to the investigator and they will issue what we call the Form FDA 42, which is a notice of inspection. What the notice of inspection is equivalent to a search warrant. Anything that is under FDA's jurisdiction, they have the right to see. You will notice when I show you the form in a moment that is issued to the clinical investigator and the institution of which they reside. But it's very personal in that the notice of inspection is to the clinical investigator. They will have the address on the 482, which generally has the location of where research has occurred or where the investigator resides, so they can find him again or send him a warning letter. But primarily, it's aimed at the clinical investigator. Then the Form 483 will be issued, and that's a list of the observations, and I'll show you an example of that. Well, when the FDA goes back, after they've issued the notice of inspection and the 483, then they're going to say, here's an establishment inspection report, what we call an EIR, to say, here's all a summary of what I did. It's a longer inspection report. That goes back to headquarters, which would be the Center for Drugs Evaluation and Research. They will read the FDA investigators' reports, and then they will do the final classification of NAI, VAI, and OAI. And then other regulatory things may occur. And that's how the process works. If all of these go well for the sponsor, then the drug gets approved. If they don't, then the FDA can add on more inspections. They can spread out and do additional. They may have some additional requirements of the sponsor. The biggest trend for 2011 that we are seeing, most drug sponsors on their first applications are being held up. We haven't seen real clear-cut first-time applications go through this year. The FDA is going back and doing additional inspections, and they should. This is the Form 482 as an example to just show. Notice that the name goes to the most responsible person of the conduct of that protocol, and that will be a clinical investigator with their name. Now, this was confusing when I first came to BIDMC. Some felt that BIDMC in itself can receive a notice of inspection from the FDA. That's untrue. You can't. If you are manipulating or conducting research as BIDMC, yes, you can receive a notice of inspection. But the notice of inspection goes to the person that has the individual responsibility for that protocol conduct, and that's the clinical investigator. Now, you'll see the name of the company goes underneath. So you might ask yourself, well, what could happen to BIDMC if an investigator's audit doesn't go well? Well, they could be invited to Congress to testify on why they can't control their organization. That's what happens. That's where congressional hearings come in. They can make it so uncomfortable that it would impact the whole organization, and that's why these inspections do need to go well. You'll notice that they'll document when they showed up, when they issued the notice of inspection. That's all because of being equivalent to a search warrant. They can't look at any record until they have served the 482. Notice also that you're not asked to sign it. It's issued to you. It's called the notice of inspection. So you don't sign this document, it's presented to you. Now let's say you're a clinical investigator and you get really excited about skipping out on your FDA inspection and you just leave it all to the research coordinator. What happens? Well, they issue it to the most responsible person. If the coordinator is the most responsible person, they would issue it to that person, right? And I have had coordinators that have received the notice of inspection. So the key there is to make sure your investigator's in town when you schedule so that they will actually receive the 482. The Form 483 is a blank sheet, and this is where your performance comes in. It's issued again to the clinical investigator. They do not sign the document. It is called the FDA's inspectional findings, and it just listed out in a logical manner, usually with the most significant findings first, and it's just filled out on this page and issued. They will have a discussion with you and then a closeout. The second part of the program is going to teach you really how, or some suggestions of how you respond to that. Now, what's important, you might ask yourself, well, how does the industry really try to monitor their trials? And based on the U.S. regulations, the sponsor tries to have their monitoring process to detect different levels of noncompliance that we discussed, significant noncompliance, and to try to stop that because the sponsor is required under U.S. regulations to secure compliance. And that's why you have the monitoring process, because the law says you shall monitor your investigations. That's a general responsibility of a sponsor under 312.50. So the sponsor will then have their monitoring process come out. If things do not go well and there's significant noncompliance found, you'll find that a sponsor will terminate that investigator's participation. They will inform the IRB. The IRB will also inform the FDA. That's a requirement of an IRB. If an investigator's performance is terminated, they must inform the FDA. So this just kind of helps you show the whole process of how noncompliance works, which is not a real good place to be there. This process, and I put this in here as we're talking about the FDA inspection process, so that you understand that IRBs and their requirements are important for you to follow, because if you don't follow those also, that can result in a complaint that would put the physician at greater risk for FDA inspection. So one key part in this whole process is noncompliance is going to occur in a trial. A lot of times we're measuring the severity. The biggest key is to prevent from having persistent problems and how to correct those. So if you have a process where, say, the monitoring process comes in and says, Dr. Smith, I want you to correct X, Y, or Z. And let's say the sponsor documents in their monitoring reports that I had retraining with the staff. And then it comes back and those same exact problems still exist and it didn't work. That shows you that the FDA could get into a part of the regulations as 312.70, which says maybe you're being deliberately not complying with regulations or repeatedly not replying. So if you start to see several of the same types of deviations, you want to put a corrective action in place that really prevent them from being persistent. And that's a huge thing that we're measuring in the inspection process. Now, what happens, unfortunately, in the monitoring process, and that's usually the most frequent feedback that you get, and if you're not monitoring your investigator-initiated trials, that's a whole other story, and we'll talk about. But a lot of these symptoms will come to you, such as a subject is out of window, or you didn't receive a certain lab or collect a certain lab on a subject, or certain information was missed. And the monitor will have all these random facts in follow-up letters to you. But generally, what we call those are symptoms of noncompliance. What they don't communicate to you is that perhaps there were these lack of clear expectations of what the role of the physician is in that protocol and what the role of the coordinator is. Or maybe there's a lack of oversight that has been demonstrated and the PI is too hands-off. Or maybe the coordinator is too overworked and can't handle the certain burden. So a lot of times whenever you are given issues in the monitoring process, you need to step back and say, do I need to really be correcting what's underneath this iceberg versus just doing a one-time correction on a smaller issue? So let me give you a really good example. I have seen instances where we were missing certain labs that should have been on a chemistry panel. And over again, we kept having monitors right. We were not getting a certain analyte done for a certain chemistry panel. So is it just that the research team I don't think that we should just do this particular one. They decided to investigate it. They went and looked into it and found when you put that panel and you ordered that panel, that particular one was not coming up because it was unique to the sponsor's protocol. They went in, got their own panel established. It took care of the problem. Versus that someone would say, well, let's just write a note to file that we missed that one. Well, fairly soon, if you get 5 or 6 of those, it looks like, well, you really didn't get underneath the iceberg and correct it. Is that clear? And we'll be doing more training on that. The bottom of the iceberg is what we call physicians or researchers or research teams that are intentionally or deliberately not complying. There's a very few in the United States, but they do exist, and I deal with them yearly. So there are physicians that sit by a pool on a Sunday afternoon and they create subjects in research. I wouldn't advise that. It's pretty detectable. But to let you know that there are those few that are there, but mostly what you're dealing with here is what's kind of in the middle. But when you get symptoms back to you, you need to really address how to correct them. Another problem is sometimes I think we get into a comfort level of what the role of whoever's sponsoring the protocol is going to do for us. And of recent, the FDA has released some pretty good information when we're not hitting the mark at getting it underneath the iceberg when we respond back to them. This particular physician responded back, well, you know what, I didn't have the data left over from the study for the FDA to look at. And then he says in this response, basically, that it's really the sponsor's mistake because they didn't give me the data. And the FDA literally says back, that's not the sponsor's responsibility. You're responsible as an investigator to have the documentation so that we can do our inspection when we show up. So the number one thing that you don't do if the FDA does give you any findings is respond back and blame the coordinator, the monitor, or the sponsor. Because they're going to say back to you that response is unacceptable and it can make a difference between them sending a warning letter or not sending a warning letter. And you have individuals to help you throughout this process to respond to FDA if you receive a 483. Now, this is really unique. This is how my mind works, and I apologize for how my mind works, but this is how it works. Probably in the first part of this conversation that we've had, I should have counted how many times I said the word process, because I could hear myself talking, and I'm saying process a lot. The key is research comes down to a process. Every protocol that you're going to do, I don't care where you are in this world, pretty much right now looks the same. I don't care if you're in Russia, I don't care if you're in California, you're here in Boston, they all look the same. There's nothing unique to them. Every time you do the informed consent process, it's the same federal regulations. They didn't change overnight. So how you store and how you control access to your informed consent should be the same every time. The process that you use to go back and check to make sure there's no current updates to informed consent when a subject comes in for their visit is the same. Times that you've got to order labs, that's the same. So our job in this whole process that we're working through as an institution is to make sure that we have processes and systems in place for you to effectively use. We have procedures in place for you to actually effectively be able to do research. And a lot of what I have been working on since November is looking at any gaps that are there and saying this is really what we need in place so that the investigators can be protected. Because one of the things that I believe in the most is that this law, as I said earlier, is very personal. And I think it is our responsibility, particularly research professionals like myself, to continue to let investigators and their research teams have the opportunity to do research. And we don't want that interrupted, because we do want these drugs that need to be to the marketplace to get to the marketplace and for this not to be a painful process. So research is a lot like a fillet of fish. It has 2 buns, a square piece of fish, and tartar sauce, and a crinkly piece of paper. And every time you go to McDonald's, you're going to get those same 2 buns, the same cheese, the same tartar sauce, and the same crinkly paper over and over again. Until you say, well, I really don't want cheese this time. I want it lighter on tartar sauce. And then it might change some. Protocols may change. But the key is look at what you do every day on the same protocols, figure out what that process is, and do that process and work that process and make it work for you. It's not like you're hunting and looking and doing as a subject is coming in and you're trying to figure out what they need. Because that's how things get missed, and that's how subjects get out a window, that's how your analysis gets missed, that's how those problems occur, because there's not a process in place. And that's the success story of McDonald's. You may not agree that their food is healthy, but you've got to agree at least that they're successful as a business, right? Now, you might be wondering how this all ties in, and there's some in industry right now, there have been some significant shots across the bow to sponsors. And I don't have Pfizer's reflected here, but Pfizer has just received a recent warning letter because of poor monitoring. Sanofi and Johnson & Johnson have received the same. These companies are huge American companies. The FDA did not randomly choose these individuals. I mean, Johnson & Johnson, for heaven's sake, still has the best smelling lotion in all of America for a baby. Hands down, you'll never be able to emulate it again. No one ever has. They chose these names purposely to say, you should be leading the industry, you're the largest, set the example. I just had the CEO of Pfizer to tell me directly that the FDA pulled him aside and said, I do expect you to lead this industry. I expect you to set these trials up right and to run them right. And this is a key. And I'm going to say, and I don't know if it's great to say, but I'm going to say, you have had industry audits here at BIDMC. You've gone through, how many of you have been through an audit in your career of a sponsor? Pfizer, AstraZeneca, a CRO, many of you have been through audits. How many of you are monitored? Monitors all the time. These people are not writing up findings just to write them up. They're giving you warnings before the FDA were to come in. So we have had some significant audits by Pfizer, and I'm just going to use them as a name because they've done some significant audits. I don't know that we're addressing those concerns, and they're a client. They are a client, and they're huge, and they can make a real big impact if we're not able to get at their products and to test them in our subjects. So one thing that I'm really dealing with right now is not only to make sure that we handle FDA matters, but when you do get a chance to correct something early that a monitor lets you know, that we're addressing those. And go ahead.
Well, I just want to make a point that what you said a little while ago about monitoring sort of showing you the end product and having multiple violations, deviations really being a symptom of a process problem.
Right.
I think it is not true that all monitors say it that way.
Right.
I think there are definitely monitors that come in and will say, gee, I'm finding the same problem over and over. Can we try to figure out what's going on and prevent it? I think there are plenty of monitors who just give you the end result.
Right.
And don't actually say it. I think to the relatively inexperienced or junior investigator, I think it may not be so obvious sometimes.
Right.
And what we sometimes try to do here when we're doing educational talks is to sort of put it in line with thinking about clinical processes. Right, that many times if you're a surgeon and you do a particular procedure, you always try to do exactly the same way to get the same outcome. And in that setting, if you get a bad outcome, you know to go back and look at the process. But I think the way you put it here to sort of say it's not just about the results. If the results are off in some way, you really do have to take that step back.
Right.
And look at the process. I think that's really an important take-home message. Because I don't think people necessarily.
Well, let me tell you this, and this is exactly what I was dealing with in this past week. If any of you think here that, and I think this is something that we do in the industry that is wrong, I mean just overall, I get very concerned when we think that a physician is going to be as good as a regulatory investigator as someone like myself, or someone who knows how to dig through problems. That's why, you have a quality assurance unit to help you. That's why you have monitors that come in, like a monitor that doesn't see a PI. And that's one of my concerns at BIDMC. We've had monitors, they've wrote all types of things to BIDMC. The monitors took it that if a PI didn't show up at a visit, well, they didn't really want to see me. Well, the PIs were under the interpretation that if you really wanted to see me, you would ask and I would come in, and I would gladly come in. Most of the PIs here really wanted to meet a monitor anytime that they asked for it, but they didn't. Because whatever reasons they didn't ask. So a lot of times when you look at between monitoring report and monitoring report, if you're an investigator and you're not getting any feedback that you're doing anything wrong, maybe everything is glowing, and maybe that's when you need to call up QACT and say, I would really like my study audited. Or I would really like QACT to come in. And now when you're a brand new investigator, you will go through an inspection process really with them to make sure that you're doing things well early. And so that process is there. You know, what I'm concerned about is everything that's resting out there right now that hasn't been addressed, and that's concerning. But these are the regulations really in 312.50 that sponsors have been getting hit on because of their poor monitoring. So what I'm saying to you is there is an FDA inspection, there's an FDA inspection process that's occurring, but you want the monitoring process and so forth to find it way before the FDA were to come out. So you want that monitoring process to be as effective as possibly that it can be. And if you're not feeling like you're being properly monitored, or you've got an investigator-initiated trial that's not being monitored, you need to ask for help. And you've got plenty of professionals here that want to help you. So data does come from these different indicators. So I think sometimes the monitoring process focuses on so much of the data. You'll notice when the monitors come in, this is what they focus on, is the clinical data. Does it actually match? And they'll ask you to change things if it doesn't. The auditing process looks at where the data comes from. You know, do you have systems? Do you have processes? Do you have procedures? Do you have proper training to do what you're going to do? And that is looking at the input, because the data comes out of those systems. And that's the difference. But a lot of times you've got to look at that I've got the qualifications to do the research, I've got the equipment to do the research, I know I'm going to be able to meet the protocol, I'm going to be able to do it, and the data will follow if you have all that in place. So that kind of wraps up part one, and I really want to get into more of the FDA inspectional process. And so before we go on, is there any additional questions on that? Nope. Okay, so we'll go on. So where we are right now is we're right at 1 o'clock. Do you want me just to continue? Because I know some were just here for 50 minutes.
We can do one of two things. We can continue, or if you'd like to come back and do a part 2 next month, first Thursday, we can do a part 2.
Yeah. All right, well, so why don't we want to pause it here? Because the next part is really the FDA inspectional process. But I would like to open it up for questions. And
We just have to say one thing.
okay.
Not all of the audience here necessarily has access to QACT.
Okay.
Because I would imagine that a lot of you guys are not necessarily doing oncology research. If you're not, you actually call our office.
Okay. Very good.
And we will come out. We're happy to come out and do study startup visits. We can do something called a study in progress assessment when you're actually going through a study. It's not an audit. It's really designed to be an educational experience. It's an opportunity for us to look at your processes, to look at how your organization works well together, your research unit works well together, and we can give you some suggestions. We can give you templates if you're having trouble just keeping track of your process. So there's an awful lot we can do if you just call us. And we'd much rather hear from you early. Sometimes we actually come to you. If we know that you're a new investigator and you're just starting here, we'll come to you and say, would you like us to sit down with you before you start your first project, or after you've consented a couple of people and you can sit down. So I just wanted to put that out there, that that's the other half of our world here. Again, if you're oncology, you call QACT. If you're anything other than oncology, you call us.
That's right. And I think what's key here, too, is when you look at the audit process, and is there anybody here who likes audits? I mean, that's one of the things. Like, anybody like to sign up for an audit or an inspection? Nobody likes audits or inspections. But the key is when your auditors or your monitors don't come from the FDA, you want to have those to be as effective as you possibly can. Like, let's just say you have a monitor currently, and that monitor comes in and they're bringing you donuts, and it's great, and it's a 4-hour day. There's no monitor in the United States of America that works 4 hours a day. I mean, for the workload that they have, it's at least 10 to 12 hours a day with what they need to be working on. So if you have monitors that you don't really feel that are being very effective for you, you want that to be highly effective, because that's usually more the daily feedback or the weekly feedback or monthly feedback that you need. You need to really be assertive and ask for that, because you want your monitoring system to be effective as it can be, and you certainly want your auditor. So when you go through an audit, whether it's QACT or with the IRB group or another independent group that you have working with you, you want to say, this is what we're having trouble with, and you really want to work with them and be open with them. And I know sometimes you don't like to receive reports back and forth, but you want to use that to your benefit, because they want to find and help you resolve problems before you go through an FDA inspection or other regulatory. You know, we have a huge survey coming up from NCI that's going to be taking place. So you want those to be highly effective. But most importantly, we want to make sure that you're able to follow the protocols that you have. Okay? Other questions? Now, this really just introduced you to the FDA process and why they do it, and we'll do a second part that really takes you through how to host and how to handle the FDA because of the time. Now you can read the slides because they're very detailed out actually from a standard operating procedure that you can read for the actual steps that we'll go through, so you can read that.